Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is going to go out on Friday, so I guess it's a recent read, but I'm only going to talk about one book, and that is Seven Steeples by Sara Baume, an Irish writer. I think this is her third novel. I first saw Bob the Bookerer talk about this. It's one of his top fiction reads for 2022. And it just coincidentally came about at the same time when Eric Lonesome Reader was talking about books about sort of hermits, people who withdraw from society, withdraw from civilization and go off to live in isolation. He didn't mention this, but I think this very much falls into that category, even though in this book it's a couple doing it rather than an individual. So this is going to be a review in two parts, or with two parts to it. One is a 5-star part and the other is a 4-star, and I levelled the read out at 4-star. So just to start with, I guess, what the story is about. So Simon, whose name throughout is reduced to Si, spelled S-I-G-H, and Isabel, name reduced to Bell, B-E-L-L, and Simon and Isabel, their full names are only ever referred to once in the novel. Anyway, they both come from large families and feel rather sort of overlooked in them. And they find each other and they start a relationship, and they determine that they want to get away from the cloud and the shadow of their families. In fact, they want to get away from civilization and just really share their life together and sort of to hell with everybody else. So they rent this sort of quite large cottage in deepest rural Ireland with only one neighbour who's a farmer. And they take their 2 dogs with them. And this book is 7 years of their life divided up into seasons, but nicely sort of, the focus isn't, you don't go sort of, in each chapter you don't go through winter, spring, summer, autumn in all 4. You gradually sort of are moving through the seasons across the 7 years. So it's sort of avoids that sort of sense of cyclical repetition. Although obviously seasonal life is cyclical. And the first thing to say is that the writing is superlative. It really draws you in. It's really immersive. There's a lot of description about, although it is a pastoral novel in many ways, it's, I think, emphasises the decay and rot that sort of gradually asserts itself. So even though you do have cycles of weather and sort of green grass returns after the rain, after the summer has browned it. So those standard sort of cycles of nature are there, but actually the emphasis is much more on rot and decay, because they too suffer a similar, very, very slow, gradual decay. They don't work, they don't interact, they don't go down to the pub, they don't really have a lot of spare money, and when things go wrong in the house, they make and men do. Whatever they can lay their hands on, they'll use to bodge the repair rather than sort of do it properly. So gradually the house which is shabby to start with and has lots of bits of detritus and unwanted stuff left by previous tenants, which they don't get rid of, they just absorb. So gradually, as the house decays, so are they decaying. And just to give you an idea about that, and I think also a good example of the writing, like Voss, who's one of the dogs, the carpet on the stairs, Belle and Si gathered fragments of their environment, a blob of toothpaste on a collar first thing in the morning, a drip of soup in the lap later on, a sediment of mud sucked up from the wet cliff path, wringing each trouser cuff. They wore them like badges of the day so far, of yesterday and the day before. So that is sort of happening to them, and things like sort of hair in the bathroom, mouse droppings, bird shit in the barn, all this sort of stuff which they don't really take on and deal with. They just let it lay there, accept it. So the house too is gradually getting sort of more and more decayed. You know, it's sort of weather beaten by the storms, by fierce winds, things like that. But the supreme achievement of the book's writing is that's never boring. It doesn't, you know, I read Daisy Hilyard's book Emergency, which was, again, pastoral, set in England, and that bored me to tears. The writing is so good here. She doesn't repeat herself. The images are very striking. They have resonance because you've got this sort of duality of what's happening to them and what's happening to the house and their local environment and stuff. So I just thought some of the writing, or not some, all of the writing in here was superb, and just, you know, I'm not particularly that interested in sort of rural pastoralism, but in this case, it's brilliantly done. I will say that every chapter is topped and tailed with a sort of repetitive motifs. So the beginning of every chapter is it's 1 year and the mountain is still not climbed, because in the distance of where they are is a mountain, and they've been told by the farmer that if you go up there you can see 7 steeples, hence the title, and also 7 other things, I can't remember what they were now. And it's a bit of a sort of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, you know. The implication is one year they'll get to climb it, but actually they spend more time at the beach, and it's interesting that the decay and rot of their house is mirrored in quite a sinister way, because on the beach it's all about plastic, the accumulation of plastic, of detritus. Nobody lives here, or very few people live here, except in the summer when people have, you know, take timeshares and things, so they bring their rubbish and stuff, but it's not even them, it's stuff that's washed up from the sea, and all this plastic, which is quite sort of on point, I think. So they never climb this mountain, so each chapter begins the second year with the mountain remaining unclimbed, and then every chapter is ended with a motif of an eye, or eyes, whereby the accumulation or the random nature of how things are affected in their environment, in the house or whatever, so gives an impression of it's an eye. So certain types of flower budding give the impression of an eye, or the way the light hits, or a hole that's been sort of gouged by the weather in a fence or something. They each lead to the imagery of an eye. And the book starts by saying the mountain is almost sort of, it's overlooking everything, but actually it's almost keeping watch on its domain of everything that lies in its purview. So hence the eye imagery has, again, a real sort of reverberation back to the mountain. And in a way, you ask, who's narrating this book? Is it Si and Belle, or is it actually the mountain is narrating it about Si and Belle? Which is, again, kind of an interesting thing. Normally that sort of anthropomorphism doesn't work, but actually it's just there. It's not overdone, it's not overstated. So I thought all of that was brilliant. The problem with this book is the characters of Si and Belle. The first thing to say is they don't work, so they can only afford this lifestyle. Admittedly, it's sort of not much above the level of poverty, rural poverty, but it's afforded by eating to their savings, but also they're on welfare. So they haven't completely left civilization behind. They're happy to take civilization's pennies to subsidise this, which I find unsatisfactory. It's not a real cutting oneself off from civilization, but that's a minor point. The problem is the two characters. They are a genuine couple. They never squabble, but they're just existing. They're not spending time, they're killing time, they're filling time. You know, they have these routines and stuff, and the routines are affected by, what time of year it is, when they go for walks on the beach and things like that. But there's no sense of movement, there's no sense of development, there's no joy. I'm not saying it's miserable, they're not miserable, but they're just empty vessels, these two. They are in a relationship, but it seems curiously, it's intimate in terms of how they shards of themselves are sprawled all over the house, and but they do everything together. There's very little separation, very little individuation. So there's no real intimacy of two people coming together. And indeed, they are sort of merging into one person that the couple becomes one entity. And in a way, there's more detail about the dogs and the characters of the dogs than there is about Belle and Cy, which I found a little odd. So again, just to give you an example of how that sort of works out in some ways. So they're talking about sort of being in bed together when it's really, really hot in the summer. At night, Belle and Cy could only muster sleep with their arms and legs stuck out from beneath the thinnest blanket. They lay so carefully. They lay without touching each other, without allowing any part of their skin to rest against a different adjacent part. Throughout the heat wave, they woke intermittently to flip the pillows, to grope with their feet for cooler pockets of the sheet. They got up and stood on the bath mat in front of the sink, splashing their sweaty limbs with water, afraid of not being able to sleep at all. They swam for longer. They swallowed a magnitude of sea air. They existed as intensely as possible in order to exhaust themselves. So that last sentence, they existed as intensely as possible in order to exhaust themselves. So they're not doing this for the intensity of the experience because they can feast on sort of sharing memories and the emotion of it. No, they're doing it so they can sleep properly at night because they must consume 8 hours or however long they sleep for, because they're filling time, they're killing time. And I found this really, really unsatisfactory. This is no idyll, and that's fine. You don't always, pastoralism doesn't always have to be idyllic. But it's just, it felt like a missed opportunity here, that they were just frittering their lives away. They weren't having emotional responses. They weren't having any intimacy, really. They weren't having any joy, as I say. And I didn't like them at all. As I say, you got more detail about the dogs, which was peculiar. It reminded me of a couple of different works. One of the works it reminded me, with this level of sort of forensic sort of detail of description of objects, particularly detritus and litter and things like that, reminded me very much of the work of Alan Rob Grier, which can never be a bad thing in my book, because Alan Rob Grier is the Don. But that sort of forensic concentration and focus on things and objects rather than people and emotions, I thought that was pretty, that got a tick from me, I guess. But Rob Grier manages to evoke emotions and psychology through the positions and the interconnections of objects in a way that this doesn't, I feel. That there is no psychology at play. They are wasting away, they are rotting. They are fusing into one being, which means there's half as much as entered the cottage. So, but I did find that, that sort of sparking of my Alan Rob Grier spidey senses. I thought that that does go into its play into its favour. I can't remember the other book that it reminded me of. So, just to sum up, 5 stars for the writing, 4 stars for what it was actually, the human element or the lack of human element or the neutral human element of it. And I've read that a couple of people on Goodreads said that this is her best yet, and it is great. But her other 2 previous books deal with similar things, about cutting yourself off, going to live in rural isolation. And I got the shtick, and if this is the best of her books so far, I feel I don't need to read the others, which I always find disappointing as a response. Kind of, if you discover a new author, you want to think, right, I want to read everything they've read. I don't feel that strongly. I mean, obviously her future books might go on to write and talk about different things. That's a whole different question. But I don't feel I need to get to her back catalogue, because this is probably the best of the 3 which are doing similar things. So all in all, I give it 4 stars. I would recommend it. If you're looking askance on pastoralism in writing, like me, actually this might realign your sensibilities on it, so it's worth it for that. If you like pastoralism, I think this is superb. If you like the Poetics of Decay, which is another one of my wheelhouses, I like descriptions of how things sort of moulder on the vine or not. Again, I recommend this wholeheartedly. But if you want a book with some development of its characters, some sort of learning and insight on their behalf, this isn't the book for you. But a really interesting experience to have such a strong sort of 5 stars reaction to the quality of the writing and the descriptions, but then to sort of have a whole star knocked off because actually at the heart of it there's a bit of a vacuum, there's a bit of a void where human beings and human emotions should be. Yes, there may be the point that the landscape dwarfs and dominates the humans, particularly the mountains, but they rather voluntarily surrender themselves and submit to that. And I'm not sure I find that a terribly edifying journey to follow. It's not even a journey, process to follow. But, you know, fascinating read. Okay, till next time.